Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Conversations, a show brought to you by Wiley, a global leader in research and education publishing. This series is about exploring the biggest opportunities in the world of academic publishing. It's about asking tough questions and getting into meaningful debate about where our industry needs to go. Now, let's start the conversation. Hi, everybody. Welcome to The Conversations. We're here to talk about the who, what, why of science communication today.
I'm Dr. David Shiffman. I am a marine conservation biologist who studies sharks and how to protect them. I'm also a public science engagement specialist and a science journalist and author.
Dr. Marisa Silveri. I direct the Neurodevelopmental Lab in Addictions and Mental Health at McLean Hospital. I'm a neuroscientist by training and late life became a mental health counselor. I do a lot of community outreach in terms of bringing science to the public.
I'm Sandeep Ravindran. I'm a freelance science journalist. I cover life sciences and technology for a variety of publications, and I also do a lot of teaching and mentoring.
Are you also a doctor?
I also have a PhD.
See, I'm the only one who's not. I'm Jay Flynn. I'm the Executive Vice President for Research and Learning at Wiley. My own sort of origin story, my journey into science probably begins when I was really little. Every summer, instead of going to camp or sitting at home and watching TV, I would go to the Dayton Museum of Natural History in Dayton, Ohio, and I would take classes called like Trees of Ohio. When we talk about science writing, what does science communication mean for you?
I teach a graduate level science communication course, and we spend an entire day on defining science communication. And there's a lot of different definitions, there's a lot of competing definitions, but a few key things that I stress with that is it's someone who has some sort of technical subject matter expertise explaining something within that area of expertise to people who do not.
There's a word you used when you were describing your role and your passions, and it was different than communicator. It was interpreter. What's that distinction about for you?
Well, I think science communication, from my perspective, there are so many, to both of your points, it's very complex, right? So it's very traditional. In graduate school, you write these papers that will be peer reviewed, and you want to be able to be sophisticated and knowledgeable and provide expertise. And then the other piece of it, though, is making that tangible for the public and be that bridge to the deep understanding of this is why it's relevant to you. So I feel like the interpretation, the interpreter part of my job is like, I have the experience and the years to be able to read a paper that's been peer reviewed in a scientific publication, digest it, and give it back in a way that really preserves sophistication and gives the message of how this is going to help someone lead a healthier life.
That's an incredible jumping off point to so many different topics that I want to get into today. It's going to be hard to pick one. Can we focus on those use cases, right? Making a healthcare decision. Give me a sense, and maybe Sandeep, I'll start with you. Like, how do you get a sense of what the impact story ought to be?
So at the very basic level, you want to convey sort of, the science that like what happened, but also I think to your point, the nuance and the complexity of what went into that result, right? I think one of the key things is to not just spit out a fact, like but the whole process of like this is how how they found this out. These are the caveats, to like why this is what we can say for now, but that is by no means definitive, and you to convey that concept of like this is a work in progress. So this one study, even if it's an excellent study and everyone agrees like this is amazing work, is just one sort of like one building block in the sort of edifice of science, right?
Right. Caveats. I've written it down. I've double underlined it. I'm going to come back to it because there's a massive discussion to be had about all of that and the public's understanding of science and the scientific method and the way science works. But coming back to impact for a second.
We're trying to protect endangered species from various threats, and scientific research is the best way to do that, evidence-based, data-driven conservation planning. But the sort of technical manuscripts that get published in journals are always going to be a vital piece underpinning that, but someone needs to go from there to explaining to a fisherman why you can't use that piece of gear in the summertime. Someone needs to go from there to saying why you should use this type of bait and not that other type of bait. And that's where this role of communicating, synthesizing science comes through. And often for me, it's less communicating the results of a specific individual paper and more about sort of the synthesis of the field so far.
I think probably in all of our roles, you have to know your audience. And with parents, I think as a scientist, you want to be cautious not to overstate any finding. But in the sense of, it occurs to me as you've asked the question that, could we ever tell parents to be too safe with their children? Probably not.
Probably not.
We have a responsibility to share the science. If we know something about the teenage brain and the risks and the harms, and as we think about alcohol use disorder and who's at risk for those types of situations, we really want to take all the data. It's a big responsibility to bear.
But a common thread in what you both just said is like there's all this data. There's data from all these different sources. Your job is to synthesize it, to turn it into easy to understand messages. Then there's all the skepticism. Skepticism from lived experience, skepticism from different values. Who knows where the skepticism comes from? Sandeep, can we overcome this with logic? Can you overcome it like with the sense of like, if you just understood the methods and the results and the double-blind control in the study and all of that? Do they need to understand the messages or the methods, or do they just need to trust the results?
There's a whole body of evidence on the studies of science communication and the impacts that basically tell you that just sort of no matter, like you can sort of convey the message, but without that trust,
Right.
It's not going to make a difference. So I think having that trust, whether it's directly with a scientist or with like a publication, that's really key to, or and I guess it's at all levels, right? It could be from your doctor, your primary care physician, but whoever you're getting that message from, I think that trust needs to be there to sort of get that message across.
When you're trying to convince people to not do something that they really want to do because of various harms, there are some people that are not going to be convincible. And to your earlier question, can you use logic and reason to convince someone? There's an old quote that you can't reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into.
Well, and I think that applies across the board. So I think we have to be mindful of, the nice thing about science communication is it's in the moment. Here's this, this soundbite that gives us information, but the science that led up to it, again, this very long arc in considering the audience, I think is a really big, important piece of it.
We've established that it's hard. What are the mistakes that you commonly see? What are the things we can stop doing as opposed to start doing or continue doing? What are some of the things we ought to stop doing in science communication? As a professional, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about where did we get it wrong?
So in terms of like the pitfalls, I think one of the pitfalls is this sort of top-down approach, whether it's from scientists or from publications, like journalistic publications.
Right.
I think that, even in any communication of science, recognizing whoever's reading it or hearing it, they're all coming from their own unique place.
One of the things that I'm really conscious of as a publisher, and we publish about 250,000, maybe 280,000 peer-reviewed studies every year. Very few of them have, although I've been hearing about it forever, plain language summaries. Should I, as a publisher, invest a lot of money in that?
A lot of the plain language summaries that I've seen in many journals are simply not very good. A lot of them simply don't summarize it in plain language. It's what I guess the expert thought was plain language, but it's almost as if they've never talked to another person who's not a PhD biochemist.
Sure.
And if the goal is plain language, you should ask someone in your life who is not a scientist if they understand what the hell you're talking about.
Right.
And
Yeah.
if they don't, that's a bad sign.
So I like the fact that they have plain language
Yeah.
summaries. I completely agree with David that most of them are really not plain language. I think that's a combination of lack of training and also just effort, right? I truly believe any scientist with sufficient effort could actually write a plain language summary of their paper, because when they're describing it to their families, that's not how they talk, right? So they have the skill, but probably, especially in a scientific journal, they're thinking, oh, well, if I actually write it down in plain language, there is this tendency to think that others will look down on me.
I've seen some scientists complain about that, oh, it's another step I have to do.
I think that it's practice and it's time, and maybe there needs to be some support to help scientists write the lay summaries.
Sure.
So, not a burden, but it's such an important part of the job. All the science that we conduct and collect the information, it's our responsibility to give it back in a way that's digestible.
One of the questions I have about sort of science making it in a public conversation and that sort of peer review to journalism pipeline has to do with the language and the barriers that language creates when trying to get journalists to report on a paper. What's going to make you pick something up? Is it that you get an assignment and you're going to cover a particular topic, or what grabs your attention as someone who's spent a lot of time in this field? What are the things that are going to get you to pay attention?
That's a great question. And I've tried to sort of define what that is. And honestly, in the simplest terms, it's something that makes you go, wow, right? It's as simple as that. Now, what that is specifically, may rely a bit on sort of your prior knowledge of
right.
oh, maybe, this paper looks really interesting, but that this has been, this is just sort of an incremental step on a lot of other sort of work that has already happened. It's one of those things where people are all, in my field, everyone's looking for, everyone goes to sort of high-profile journals looking for the papers, and it really is sort of you develop a feel for what is newsworthy.
Right.
Everyone loves sharks.
Sure.
People love things to do with the brain because it's part of sort of understanding ourselves.
Human evolution, people love that.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think things that convey a sense of wonder, all of those things. And then there's the news you can use, right? Anything to do with health, that is always very helpful. Some things that are just cool, like new technology.
Right.
So I think it's this sort of, I've tried to think about how best to define it,
right.
but it really is this sort of sense you get of oh, this is something that people will pay attention to.
I also do freelance science journalism, but generally take a different approach from Sandeep and people at his level, where if I look, there's 30 other high-profile journalists who have written about that topic for other outlets. I usually write about stuff that no one else is covering. So I wait until after it's published. If there's a press release, I'm not going to touch it. And I can focus on sort of more niche issues that I am knowledgeable about because I am a subject matter area expert in there. I would say 95% of the stories I've written have started with, wow, I like that it makes me read it and go, that's really interesting.
So capturing that sense of wonder, I think we can all relate to wow, right? Wow, there's a technology to image the brain. Wow. We figured something out about an early primate, or we figured something out about shark evolution, or we figured something out about a new energy technology that might be a game changer. I think it's a huge structural barrier to talking about science, that science changes. I think it's the beauty of science and the wonder of scientific discovery that science is always changing. But I do think, I went to school in the 70s, and my science textbook said, one day we're going to put a man on the moon, right? And I was skeptical of my science textbook as a fourth grader and everything that was in it because the man had been to the moon. And I think the manifestation of that in today's highly social media amplified, highly politicized environment around science is skepticism about all science. Where have you had the most success at breaking that down for people?
I think the biggest thing, at least for me, where I've seen, sort of people understand, the complexity of science is just really making sure to convey the process of science, right? But providing both the nuance and the context. And typically what happens is in a news story, they don't convey that context. They'll just say, oh, a new study came out that says eggs are bad for you. And I think it's really important, no matter how short the story, to sort of convey that this was a process.
Sure.
Here's why we thought something different earlier, and this is why this has changed.
Are there techniques though that what's your one neat trick for getting that notion across?
I think for me, thinking about the technology, right? With the development or the evolution of imaging technology, we actually can confirm what we've known from
Right.
studying people after
Right.
brain injury or after they've died. And so what makes it new now? What makes it new now is this evolution of technology that allows us to have a window into the brain that is in real time. And so how has that changed what we've always known? I think that letting people know that it's really only, it's like the next episode is coming.
I want to pick back up on this concept of convincing people with logic in the era of social media, convincing people of, how do you explain a 5-arm clinical trial to somebody in a 10-second TikTok video?
It's a tough one, without entirely diluting everything about it.
Exactly.
What are you looking for? A soundbite? That's about all you have time for.
And then what do you do about bad actors?
Yeah, so I am one of the most followed scientists on social media, and I've trained a couple thousand early career researchers all over the world how to use these tools for public science engagement. And one of the biggest problems is bad actors. Sometimes there are people who really want to help, but they don't know what's really going on. Yeah. And those people tend to have messages that spread more rapidly, they go more viral than someone who's a PhD researcher. It's absolutely a huge problem dealing with these people who are spreading misinformation, or in some cases even disinformation, with things like new ownership at Twitter. They changed it so that the fact-checking rules aren't there anymore, so that blatantly wrong, harmful information is not only allowed to spread, but in some cases encouraged by the algorithm. What I try to do is try to convince more experts to get involved in these discussions. I try to reach out to the persuadable people who are saying wrong information, who are maybe well-intentioned but not necessarily well-informed, and say, hey, it's so great that you care, it's so great that you're trying to help. As an expert, I have some concerns. Are you willing to have a conversation about it? And about half the time they are. I think recent events have shown that it is not good for society to let demonstrably false information stand unchallenged in the public square. So what I have found works okay is challenge it once, say that's wrong, here's how we know it's wrong, here's what's right, here's how we know it's right. Does anyone else have any questions? I might persuade other people who are watching, who might have thought there's something to it.
Earlier in my publishing career, I used to go to a couple of different universities that had library schools, and I would talk to students who were getting a master's in library science. And the publisher's here to talk about publishing stuff, I would always say, every one of you, you're at this great school, every one of you should go take a class in accounting. Every one of you should go take a class in marketing. Should every postdoc be forced to take a social media class?
I mean, I don't think so, but I do think every aspiring sort of scientist, grad students, postdocs, should get some training in science communication. The reason I say not necessarily social media is because I think there's any number of ways that they can contribute to the conversation. Yeah. And some people are great at social media, they love doing it, but maybe for someone else it's going and talking to your local council members, right? And trying to affect policy that way. Maybe it's going to your local middle schools, right? So I think some training in science communication, I think I would love to see everyone in science getting that, and then also be encouraged to reach out and do outreach and engagement, just getting that outreach and engagement in whatever way that you are most comfortable in.
So I have often said I don't think it should be required for everyone to do it, but I think everyone should be aware of why it's important, and I think the people who want to do it should be more supported professionally by academia than they are. A lot of my colleagues who do this stuff, it doesn't count towards traditional hiring, tenure, promotion stuff. They have to do their traditional leadership and service activities, curriculum committee, and then they do this on the side. And this is important service. It should count as leadership and service in academia, tenure, hiring, and promotion.
Are there credit structures that should be implemented, you think, more widely around communication?
I mean, that is something that's changed over the last couple decades, particularly at Harvard Medical School, is, an acknowledgement that if you do public education and outreach, not even clinical teaching, that there will be some credit as a significant supporting activity. Really acknowledging that, wow, there has to be a space, so if you go up for promotion or whatever the next step in the ladder is for you, that you're acknowledged as someone who's making contributions. I do think that people should get training in social media or presentations. Now, I do not have a social media following. I don't post things. Part of that, I think, bears out from a little bit of fear of, I can share my science, but unless you stay on the track, unless you keep up with it, you post one thing once, you have to keep doing it the whole time. And that feels a little hard for scientists too. It's tricky.
With misinformation, with AI, with changes in funding priorities every 4 years, with the very contentious relationships between political actors and universities, I think it's trite to say that science is at an inflection point. I don't think that captures it. I think it's deeper than that. But in your opinion, are scientists fighting with one hand behind their back? Shouldn't scientists be joining forces and doing all those things that we just talked about?
I mean, to me, absolutely. I would love to see that. My theory is that both scientists and science journalists, too, have sort of taken for granted a bit that people care about science and will support it. And I think that is unfortunately not necessarily still the case. And I think it's up to, not just those of us who are already doing it so, but everyone else who cares about science and science communication to be sort of making an affirmative case for those things.
So let me ask you, what should publishers be doing more of? Because we have a role, a right, a responsibility, a need to participate in this discourse differently.
I think engaging the young investigators, the young scientists, because I think there's more of an interest and a willingness and a comfort technologically to really think about these things in a social media presence. And it's kind of interesting with all the teaching. I do a lot of mentoring, and I have learned as much from junior trainees about where they see science and the importance of sharing it with the public as I've been able to teach about the scientific method, right? So I think that really an acknowledgement, continuing to support junior folks to be able to do both things. This is the next generation of scientists who are going to continue the work, and letting them know that misinformation is a thing. And how do we avoid it? What are our best practices across the board? And how can we get that information out most effectively?
We have, as a scaled science publisher, we have a lot of tools at our disposal. We're not creating social media training for young scientists. What are the specific tools that you think we ought to be bringing to bear? What would help you in your job? What would help you in your policy advocacy? What would help you in your public outreach that a publisher could do? You could publish a paper with us, and what comes after and?
A lot of these studies that get so much amazing media attention, that a major treatment for a disease or something like that, I don't think I've ever seen a newspaper article about it say, and this was funded by a taxpayer-funded grant. That stuff is usually in the acknowledgments section at the end of a paper that no one other than the author's family reads. It would be great if when we communicated, that's because of taxpayer-funded grants. You love sea turtles. The sea turtle population is rebounding because of this paper that was funded by a grant from the Fish and Wildlife Service. The most radical cuts to funding in science are bad and we shouldn't do them. There's a step that's not happening.
Pushing that, helping with that narrative, helping draw those links, I can get my arms around that.
Yeah, to add to that too, not only acknowledging these are taxpayer dollars, the NIH, this is money that you've helped support. I do think that's a really good point, that, letting people know that actually these data belong to you. I think that having a part in where it came from is the important part. Or maybe people will be like, yeah, but I don't agree that that's how I want you to spend my tax dollars on those studies. So it's clearly a very tricky line to balance.
But, are the incentives right around sharing of experimental data, of results?
So in global shark conservation research, we have this organization called the IUCN Red Lists Shark Specialist Group. And they do absolutely amazing work with data sharing and large-scale collaboration. And the way they make it happen is everyone signs this data sharing agreement, And if you share your data that's not published yet, but because you want to get it into this big report, everyone else participating knows that they can use it after you're done.
Yeah.
And also, sometimes they'll reach out to you and say, hey, colleague from Brazil who doesn't have a lot of experience using this sort of analysis, can I help you and be a co-author on the paper with your data? That happens all the time, and it's great. And there's a real collaborative model that has been helpful for everyone getting more publications, everyone burning through the data that's otherwise just sitting in a drawer, but also funders like it. That exact problem of someone does a study and then they don't publish it,
Sure.
and then they say they're going to share the data, but they never do, is a thing that private philanthropy funding does not like.
Right.
And that the Shark Specialist Group is able to say, look, because of these collaborations, it didn't just generate this report, it generated these ongoing teams, it generated these ongoing projects, it generated these 30 other papers that would not have happened otherwise. That helps.
Do you think it would accrue to the benefit of trust in science if we were transparent about all the stuff that didn't work or all the stuff that we tried?
I mean, yeah, you're talking about the tip of the iceberg. That's all we see, right?
Right.
I mean, the other thing about trying to reconcile the null findings from the significant findings is that it's already so much information to process and manage.
Yes.
It's exhausting on any level. And if all of a sudden we have to add in, okay, there's all this sophisticated science and here's the findings. Oh, but then there's also all of this that, was basically not significant. I feel like that's asking the people to do extra work.
Is there something in that science communication can learn from?
I mean, it's interesting because I think one of the things that so like you said, it's the tip of the iceberg, but I think knowing the rest of the shape of that iceberg is really important for good science communication and also for good science journalism. So what invariably ends up happening in my field is, you look at some papers or you look at some press releases and it'll say something, but then it's through the process of reporting that you talk to enough people in the field, you get a sense of that shape, right? You might ask them, why wasn't this other things studied? And somebody knows the answer to that, right? Maybe they did it and it didn't work, or it was too hard to do, or the tools didn't exist then and they do now. So there is an answer. So in my field, we get that answer by just talking to enough scientists, right? But if you're a grad student, you don't have the capability to just call up the entire field and say, and even if you did, who knows if they'd necessarily talk to you, again, because you're worried about being scooped. So I do think that information is really valuable, and it would be great to have it out there.
I think we should absolutely also not misrepresent the strength of our argument, because then if we say, no, we're absolutely sure it's this, trust us, we're experts, and then we learn in 10 years that that's not true, those people are not going to trust us in the future.
I do think that over-explaining can sometimes be a challenge. It can be a barrier, right? The soundbite is often more effective if you're trained in media. You can look better in media, right? Coming back to media for a second, the question I ask myself a lot, a couple years ago at New York Academy of Sciences, I sat with a bunch of science journalists and I asked the same question, so I'm going to ask it to you now. What could improve the relationship between publishers and journalists in science?
I mean, overall, I think in general, as you sort of brought up, more transparency, the access to sort of, primary literature, all the supplementary materials. Those are sort of, the more information we have, I think the easier it becomes for us to sort of, make our own assessment of sort of the science. In a broader sense, sort of going back to the sort of the plain language summaries and any amount of sort of training or tools for the scientists to sort of think about when they're publishing, what would sort of the what could the impact of this be, for a general audience, I think would be sort of just getting them even in that mindset, I think would be really helpful.
Okay. Just a lightning round kind of question real quick. In each of your minds, what's the biggest risk if we don't get better at communicating about science?
The people who either don't know what they're talking about or do know what they're talking about and are trying to commit harm are not shy about talking about this, and they're very good about doing it in a persuasive way. And if they win, that is bad for everyone.
What do you think?
I worry about keeping our finger on the pulse of what's important to people. That if, science bears importance and meaningful discovery is really what's going to ultimately help mental health and well-being or just physical health, if we don't stay on top of that and really know what's important, what's on everybody's minds, that's kind of my big one place where I'm like, I want to make sure I know what's important to people at the time.
Okay. What about you?
Yeah, I worry about losing the public, public interest in science, public, caring about making sure that science is funded, all of the things that sort of, right now, yes, scientists are always come up as being highly trusted, but I don't think that we should take that, there are forces that are actively chipping away at that, and so I don't think we should take that for granted. And I think without good science communication, that is a real risk.
If you came across a super keen graduate student who was also interested in writing, and you met him or her, and they said, I'm really interested in becoming a science communicator, what's the single best piece of advice you could give them?
I would say do as much of it as you can in whatever way you can. Because I think a lot of the time when I talk to graduate students, and a lot of grad students reach out and are interested, but they don't know how to get started, or they think it's sort of like, oh well, how do I write an article for the New York Times? And it doesn't have to be starting with an article for the New York Times, right? Like do an Instagram post about your own research, write a blog post about your own research. That's just any way that speaks to you to sort of find a way to convey your research or any research that interests you, to an audience that doesn't know that research, I think is a great starting point.
I feel like just learning about what options are out there, that is something I will pass on to trainees who have never thought about science writing. So it's kind of hearing what's available and what are possibilities and sharing them.
Yeah.
I think sharing best practices always of
okay.
I've not been to it, but I heard that this is a really great event. And I always tell trainees whenever they go to a scientific meeting, I was like, your job here is to introduce yourself to 3 people you've never met before, right? So whether it's someone whose research you really like, or a leader in the field who you're maybe intimidated to talk to, or just someone who might be one of your peers. Always meet 3 people so that you can walk away from this meeting having made connections, because I think connections are really the currency for all of it.
So great.
So to add to those excellent pieces of advice, I'd say we always tell people if you want to be a better writer, read a lot, right? Watch people who are good at it and learn from them. And think about not only what is the information contained in those words, but why did they organize the words in those ways? If you were trying to convey this idea, how would you do it? Things like that, what I call active analytical reading. It's a skill I try to teach my grad students. The way that I structure this graduate level science communication course is a mix of reading how-to guides produced by journals, produced by professional societies, produced by museums, and then watching people do it.
Yeah.
So there's a guide of how to give a good public presentation, verbal presentation about science, and then go watch 5 TED Talks. There's a guide to how to be interviewed by a journalist, then go read 5 or listen to 5 podcasts and see how they do it. There's a guide to how to write an effective op-ed. Do that, then read 5 op-eds and compare this is that thing that it said to do. They did it really well here. Oh, this is that thing it said not to do. Why did they do that? It undermines the piece. So a mix of sort of how-to guides and foundational theory and actively observing people doing this well. One thing that people have a real advantage of in getting started in science communication right now, which was not the case when we started, is there's now whole fields of this. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are best practice guides, there are people who've studied what works and what doesn't work, and there are people who've done it successfully who would be delighted to talk to you and offer you advice. So take advantage and stand on the proverbial shoulders of giants.
If I could boil down what I just heard into 2 things, it's do it, right? And ask for help in doing it, right? Build your network. Those are great pieces of advice, and I think they probably apply more broadly in general in life. So but in terms of network, it's always wonderful to build one, a small one, to build community, even if a small one. I'm extremely grateful to the 3 of you for being part of our network today and helping me build some community. It's been amazing. Thank you so much for participating in the conversations. I really appreciate it.